On a warm afternoon in a quiet small town, life bustled inside an old-fashioned diner nestled at the heart of the main street. This diner wasn't just any place to grab a quick bite. It was the kind of classic, elegant spot where locals gathered, tourists stopped in for a taste of nostalgia, and everyone found comfort in its inviting atmosphere. The smell of freshly brewed coffee, sizzling bacon, and warm pastries filled the air, creating a cozy charm that made people linger just a bit longer. Today, though, there was an unusual tension hanging in the air, a feeling that perhaps something was about to shift. Amidst the cheerful clinking of cutlery and soft chatter of patrons, an undertone of unease seemed to sneak in, subtle but undeniable. In the middle of the bustling crowd, a young black waitress named Sarah moved gracefully between tables, her polite smile never faltering. Sarah was well loved by the regulars, known for her kindness and quick wit. She carried herself with quiet strength, her eyes reflecting both warmth and resilience, signs of someone who had faced life's trials and still chose kindness. Though she was polite and humble, there was a natural elegance about her, one that made people feel respected and valued in her presence. As Sarah poured coffee and took orders with her usual professionalism, the door swung open and in walked Mr. Harrison. Tall, with a firm posture and a well-tailored suit, he was a familiar face in town. A local businessman with a reputation for being proud, maybe a bit too proud. His presence commanded attention, and as he walked in, the energy in the diner shifted just a little more. To the townsfolk, Mr. Harrison was known to carry an air of superiority, often looking down on others who didn't match his social status or expectations. He was used to getting what he wanted without question, and his piercing gaze and sharp tongue made most people in town step out of his way. As Mr. Harrison took his seat near the window, his eyes scanned the room with a hint of disdain. When Sarah approached to take his order, there was an almost imperceptible look in his eyes, a flash of irritation, maybe even contempt. To him, Sarah represented everything he dismissed, someone young, humble, and in his mind, beneath him. As she asked, "Good afternoon, sir. What can I get for you today?" Mr. Harrison barely looked up. He offered a curt response, ordering with a tone that held no warmth. Sarah, keeping her composure, jotted down his order, her polite smile unwavering, though anyone looking closely might have seen a flicker of discomfort in her eyes. But Sarah remained calm, determined not to let his attitude affect her. Still, there was something foreboding in the air, a hint of conflict that seemed to hang between them. Mr. Harrison's assumptions about Sarah were clear, though he hadn't voiced them directly yet. But those preconceived notions about who she was, where she came from, and how he thought she ought to be treated were there, simmering under the surface. In a matter of moments, those unspoken thoughts would soon spill out, setting off a chain of events neither of them could foresee. As Sarah returned with Mr. Harrison's coffee, she carefully set the steaming cup in front of him, her hands steady, her smile as polite as ever. But Mr. Harrison barely acknowledged her presence, his gaze fixed elsewhere, as if she were invisible. The other patrons continued their meals, unaware of the quiet storm brewing at this particular table. "Is there anything else I can get for you, sir?" Sarah asked, her voice calm and respectful. Mr. Harrison's eyes flicked up to meet hers, cold and critical. "I'll tell you if I need anything. Don't just assume," he replied curtly, his voice loud enough that a few nearby tables looked over in mild surprise. Sarah's cheeks flushed slightly, but she nodded and stepped back, determined to keep her composure. She was no stranger to customers with strong opinions, but something about Mr. Harrison's tone and attitude was cutting, sharp as a blade. A few moments later, as Sarah continued serving other tables, she could feel Mr. Harrison's eyes following her, as if assessing her every move. He seemed to find some perverse satisfaction in scrutinizing her work, his expression growing more critical each time she passed by. When she brought his food to the table, he barely waited for her to set it down before his voice cut through the air. "I hope you got the order right this time," he said, glancing at the plate with clear dissatisfaction. Sarah took a quiet breath. "Yes, sir. I made sure to get everything just as you ordered." Mr. Harrison scoffed, pushing his plate aside slightly, not even bothering to touch the food. "I don't know how people expect to run a decent place with help like this," he muttered, though loud enough for Sarah to hear. Sarah's grip on her tray tightened, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Is there something I can help you with, sir?" she asked, her voice a little quieter, but still steady. Mr. Harrison looked up, and for the first time he addressed her directly, his gaze filled with thinly veiled contempt. "Yes, you can start by getting a proper attitude, young lady," he sneered. "I don't know what's become of this place. Standards have certainly dropped, that's for sure." A wave of silence seemed to ripple around them as the nearby patrons, sensing the tension, began to turn their attention to the scene unfolding. Sarah felt a knot tighten in her stomach, but she wouldn't let him see that he was getting to her. She nodded, offering a polite response. "I'm sorry if there's anything unsatisfactory, sir. Please let me know if I can correct anything." Mr. Harrison let out a low chuckle, his eyes narrowing. "You really think I'd waste my time explaining things to you? Look around. People like you don't understand what quality is," he said with an arrogant smirk, gesturing around the diner. The meaning of his words hung heavily, the disdain clear in every syllable. Sarah's face remained neutral, but inside a mix of emotions stirred. Hurt, frustration, even a flicker of anger. She had dealt with difficult customers before, but this felt different. The blatant disrespect, the way he seemed to look right through her, assuming he knew everything about her just by looking. Each word dug deep, chipping away at her calm exterior. Just then, an older man at a nearby table, who had been watching quietly, cleared his throat. "Young lady, is everything all right here?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. Sarah turned, offering the gentleman a grateful smile, but before she could respond, Mr. Harrison interjected. "Oh, I assure you, sir, everything is just fine. I'm simply teaching her a bit about proper service, something she's clearly lacking," he said with a smug grin. The older gentleman raised an eyebrow, a look of disapproval crossing his face. "Well, it seems to me she's doing a fine job. Maybe the issue lies elsewhere," he remarked pointedly, casting a meaningful look at Mr. Harrison. Mr. Harrison's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing as he realized his authority was being subtly questioned. "I don't need anyone's opinion on how I handle my affairs," he snapped, brushing the comment off with irritation. But the tension had been broken, and Sarah, feeling a sense of quiet support from the stranger, stood a little taller, her polite smile now tinged with resilience. The moment felt fragile, balanced on a knife's edge, but Sarah knew it wasn't over. Mr. Harrison's demeanor had only hardened, and his disdainful gaze returned to her, filled with the unspoken belief that she was beneath him. But deep down, she knew he was in for a shock, one that would challenge every preconceived notion he had, even if he couldn't see it yet. As the afternoon wore on, the mood in the diner grew tense. Mr. Harrison's complaints became louder, his words sharper, each one designed to belittle and undermine Sarah's every move. He scrutinized her with an intensity that made her feel as though she were under a spotlight, expected to perform to his impossible standards. He would call her over for the smallest things, a napkin slightly out of place, a refill that wasn't immediate, making a show of pointing out each perceived flaw with exaggerated irritation. The other diners exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of sympathy for Sarah and disapproval toward Mr. Harrison. Some muttered under their breath, quietly questioning why he seemed intent on making her life difficult. Sarah felt their eyes on her, but she was determined to remain professional, to show she was above the petty jabs and criticisms he threw her way. At one point, as she passed by, Mr. Harrison raised his voice, addressing her in a tone loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Do you even understand what good service is?" he sneered, shaking his head in feigned disappointment. "Back in my day, people knew how to work with respect and diligence. You youngsters think you can just walk in here and do the bare minimum. No standards, no work ethic, no sense of quality." Sarah swallowed the retort bubbling inside her, her fingers clenched around her tray as she forced herself to take a deep breath. She wanted to tell him that she worked hard every day, that she took pride in her job and respected everyone who came through the doors of that diner, no matter who they were. But she knew that standing up to him in front of everyone could only make things worse. As she turned to leave his table, Mr. Harrison let out a loud scoff, as though amused by her restraint. "Of course, just walk away." Can't handle a little criticism, can you? He taunted, leaning back in his chair with a smug expression. I knew it, just as I expected. Sarah felt a pang of hurt at his words, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. She simply nodded, keeping her eyes lowered, and moved on to serve the other tables. But inside, the hurt was building, mingling with frustration. She was trying so hard to keep her composure, to maintain the professionalism she had always been proud of, but Mr. Harrison's constant jabs were testing her patience. Just then, a mother with a young child seated nearby turned to her, offering her a warm, understanding smile. Don't let him get to you, sweetheart. You're doing a wonderful job, she whispered softly, giving Sarah a reassuring pat on the arm. The gesture, though small, warmed Sarah's heart, easing some of the tension she had been holding in. She managed a grateful smile, feeling the strength of the silent support from the customers around her. But as comforting as their kindness was, she knew that Mr. Harrison's demeaning words would continue until he was satisfied, or until something else intervened. As she returned to the counter, she noticed Mr. Harrison waving her over again, an impatient scowl on his face. She steeled herself, hoping he would simply ask for the check and leave. But when she reached his table, he looked up with that familiar disdain, clearly ready to deliver another insult. I'm not paying for this meal. It's disgraceful, he declared, gesturing at the untouched plate in front of him. Cold, tasteless, poorly presented. Are you people even trying? He glanced around the diner, as if expecting everyone to agree with his assessment. In fact, I might just report this place to the health department. No one should have to put up with this kind of service. Sarah felt her stomach drop at his words. It wasn't enough for him to berate her. Now he wanted to threaten her livelihood, the place she worked hard to keep afloat and served with pride. She felt her calm start to slip, her frustration bubbling dangerously close to the surface. But just as she opened her mouth to respond, another voice cut in. That's quite enough, sir, said the older gentleman who had intervened earlier, his voice steady and unwavering. His eyes were fixed on Mr. Harrison, unblinking and resolute. You've made your point, and I believe we can all agree it was made in poor taste. Mr. Harrison's face flushed, and he turned to glare at the older man, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged in such a way. I don't believe I asked for your opinion, he replied, his voice tight with irritation. I am merely stating facts. People pay good money for decent service, and when they don't get it, they have a right to complain. The older man held his ground, his calm demeanor unwavering. There's a difference between expressing concern and berating a young woman simply trying to do her job. Perhaps it's time to show a little respect. A tense silence fell over the diner as everyone watched the exchange. Mr. Harrison shifted uncomfortably, the smugness in his expression now replaced by a look of barely concealed embarrassment. For a moment, it seemed like he might let it go, that he would back down. But the anger in his eyes suggested he wasn't quite ready to leave without a parting shot. As he looked back at Sarah, she met his gaze with a newfound strength. She no longer felt the need to hide her discomfort or mask her frustration. Something had shifted in her, a realization that she didn't have to accept his treatment just to keep the peace. Little did Mr. Harrison know, this was just the beginning, and that his assumptions about Sarah and about himself would soon come crashing down in ways he could never imagine. After the tension-filled exchange, Sarah retreated to the counter, her heart pounding as she tried to calm herself. Mr. Harrison's words still stung, but the quiet support from the older man and the mother with the young child reminded her that not everyone shared Mr. Harrison's cruel views. She drew strength from their kindness, feeling a renewed sense of resilience. She didn't need to let his narrow-mindedness define her day or her worth. But Mr. Harrison wasn't finished. He seemed even more determined to assert his authority now, his glare fixed on Sarah as though she were some obstacle to be dealt with, rather than a human being with her own dignity. He tapped his glass loudly, beckoning her over with a curt gesture. She approached, her polite mask back in place. Yes, sir. Is there anything else I can get for you? He sneered. How about some basic manners, young lady? You could learn a thing or two about respect. In my day, people like you knew their place. His voice dripped with disdain, his words designed to wound. Sarah felt the familiar sting of his insults, but this time, she held her ground. She looked him in the eye, a spark of determination shining through the hurt. I'm sorry if I haven't met your standards, sir, she said, her voice steady. I do my best to treat everyone with respect. Respect? He scoffed. If this is your idea of respect, I'm sorely disappointed. The diner fell silent again, all eyes on Mr. Harrison and Sarah. But this time, before she could respond, her unexpected ally, the older gentleman from earlier, stood up and walked over to their table. He moved slowly, his posture upright, his face calm but resolute. His presence commanded attention, and his quiet confidence filled the room with a reassuring strength. Sir, I think it's time you reconsider your approach, he said, his voice low but firm. His eyes met Mr. Harrison's with a calm but unyielding gaze. This young lady has done nothing to deserve your treatment, Mr. Harrison scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. I don't believe I asked for your opinion, sir. I'm simply here to get what I paid for. That's all. The older man tilted his head slightly, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. Funny thing about respect, he replied, his tone calm yet pointed. It's earned by giving it. And it's clear to everyone here that this young lady has shown more grace and patience than anyone could reasonably expect. A ripple of agreement moved through the diner as patrons nodded and murmured their support. Mr. Harrison glanced around, suddenly realizing he didn't have the audience he'd imagined. The satisfaction on his face dimmed, replaced by a flash of embarrassment. Are you suggesting I'm being unreasonable? He asked, his voice defensive. The older man shrugged lightly, maintaining his calm. I'm suggesting that maybe you're seeing only what you choose to see, he said, his words carrying a subtle weight. And I think you'll find there's more to people than the labels you put on them. For the first time, Mr. Harrison looked taken aback. He seemed at a loss for words, his confidence shaken. Sarah watched in quiet awe, feeling a surge of gratitude for the stranger who had stepped in when she needed it most. It was rare for someone to stand up to people like Mr. Harrison, to show that even the smallest acts of kindness and courage could disrupt the cruelty of prejudice. The gentleman turned to Sarah, his gaze warm and reassuring. You're doing just fine, he said softly, giving her a small nod. People who treat others with respect are the ones worth listening to. Sarah felt a lump in her throat, a mixture of relief and gratitude filling her chest. For so long she had endured encounters like this alone, quietly bearing the weight of others' assumptions and judgments. But in this moment, she realized she wasn't as alone as she'd felt. Mr. Harrison, however, wasn't ready to concede. He straightened up, his expression hardened once again, though it was clear he had lost some of his composure. I don't need a lecture on respect, he muttered, his voice unsteady. I know exactly who deserves mine. But as he looked at the older man, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. The stranger's calm strength seemed to unsettle him, as though he were suddenly seeing himself through a different lens, one that revealed the ugliness of his behavior for what it truly was. The older man remained silent, his gaze unwavering, simply waiting for Mr. Harrison to decide whether he would double down or walk away. And as Mr. Harrison shifted uncomfortably, a sense of anticipation filled the room, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see if he would change or continue down this path of disdain. In that silent moment, Mr. Harrison's carefully crafted image of superiority began to crack, and he was left with a choice: to persist in his arrogance or to open his eyes to the humanity around him. Mr. Harrison sat there, glaring at the older man, his expression a mixture of defiance and embarrassment. The support for Sarah, the soft murmurs of approval for the older man's words, and the silent but steady gaze of everyone around them had all chipped away at his confidence. Still, he wasn't about to give in so easily, especially not to the young woman he had set out to belittle. He forced a mocking smile, shaking his head. Fine. Maybe everyone here is comfortable with lower standards, but where I come from, we have expectations. He turned his gaze back to Sarah, his tone dripping with contempt. It's just a shame when people don't know their place. The older man let out a quiet sigh, giving Mr. Harrison a look of pity mixed with disappointment. But before he could say another word, the mother with the young child leaned over, her voice calm but unmistakably firm. Sir, you've made your point, and I think we've all heard enough. Mr. Harrison, taken aback by yet another voice of opposition, looked around the diner as if searching for someone to validate his views. but all he saw were faces of disapproval. It was clear now, he was alone in his prejudice, an outsider in his own small world of superiority. Just then, the door to the diner swung open, and in walked a man in a well-tailored suit, exuding a quiet confidence similar to the older gentleman. The newcomer had a composed, authoritative air about him, and as he surveyed the room, his gaze landed on Sarah. A warm smile crossed his face, and he nodded in her direction. "Sarah," he greeted, his voice friendly but respectful. "I thought I'd stop by and say hello. It's been too long." The entire diner seemed to take note of the interaction, and Mr. Harrison's eyes narrowed as he watched this man approach Sarah. There was a familiarity between them, a mutual respect that spoke volumes without words. Curious whispers rippled through the diner as patrons exchanged glances, wondering who this man was and what connection he had to the young waitress. Sarah's eyes lit up with a mixture of surprise and delight. "Mr. Lawson, it's good to see you again." She straightened her posture, and for a moment her usual humble demeanor was replaced by something different, something confident and self-assured. Mr. Harrison's sneer faded as he watched the exchange, his expression morphing into confusion. Who was this man, and why was he speaking to Sarah with such respect? As if sensing the unspoken questions in the room, Mr. Lawson turned to the other patrons, his calm smile never faltering. "I have the pleasure of knowing Sarah from the local university. She's one of the brightest students I've had the honor to teach." The room fell silent, and all eyes turned to Sarah, who looked down modestly but with a quiet pride. Mr. Harrison's face went pale, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to process this new information. Sarah, this young woman he had belittled and dismissed, was a university student, someone respected by an esteemed professor. Mr. Lawson continued, glancing at Mr. Harrison with a polite but piercing gaze. "And not just any student. Sarah is a top performer, known for her intelligence, her kindness, and her dedication. She's been working here to support herself while she pursues her studies. It's rare to meet someone with her level of resilience and grace." Mr. Harrison's face flushed red as the weight of Mr. Lawson's words sank in. The realization hit him hard. He had misjudged Sarah, blinded by his own assumptions and prejudice. His arrogance had led him to believe she was somehow less than him, unworthy of respect. And now, in front of everyone, he was forced to confront the truth of his mistake. But Mr. Lawson wasn't finished. He looked at Mr. Harrison with a knowing expression, a subtle challenge in his eyes. "Sometimes, sir," he said gently, "it's worth remembering that a person's worth isn't defined by their job, but by their character. And Sarah has proven time and again that she is someone of great character." The other patrons nodded, murmuring in agreement, casting judgmental glances at Mr. Harrison. He shifted in his seat, suddenly uncomfortable, his eyes darting between Sarah and Mr. Lawson, unable to fully meet their gazes. The smugness he'd worn like a badge of honor had disappeared, replaced by a quiet shame he could no longer hide. Unable to handle the weight of everyone's judgment, Mr. Harrison finally muttered, I didn't realize." Sarah, watching him closely, felt a mixture of emotions, relief, satisfaction, even a hint of pity. But she knew this moment wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been underestimated, belittled, or judged based on surface-level assumptions. Taking a breath, she spoke up, her voice steady but compassionate. "Sometimes, sir, it's easy to see what we want to see. I may be a waitress, but that doesn't define who I am, and neither does a person's opinion of me." She met his gaze, offering him a small but meaningful smile. "I hope one day you see that everyone deserves respect, regardless of their job or background." Mr. Harrison stared at her, speechless, his expression softening as her words hit him with a truth he could no longer deny. The realization was bitter, and he couldn't hide the regret in his eyes as he nodded slightly, acknowledging the lesson he had been forced to learn. As he stood to leave, Mr. Lawson gently patted Sarah's shoulder, offering her a proud smile. "You handled that beautifully, Sarah. Remember, people see what they want to see, but those who truly know you, they'll see you for who you really are." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest, a newfound strength blossoming in her heart, and as Mr. Harrison walked out of the diner, humbled and changed, She knew that her value could never be determined by someone else's narrow vision of the world. In that quiet diner, Sarah had not only defended her own dignity, but had also reminded everyone present of the true meaning of respect and compassion. And for Mr. Harrison, it was a lesson he would carry with him, one he would never forget. As Mr. Harrison left the diner, Sarah felt a profound sense of relief. She took a moment to gather herself, the tension of the past hour slowly dissolving. The quiet support from Mr. Lawson and the patrons had rekindled her confidence, reminding her of the journey that had brought her here and the struggles she had overcome. Sarah's story was one of perseverance and quiet strength. Born and raised in a small town not far from where the diner stood, she had faced more than her share of challenges. Her family, hardworking and close-knit, had always taught her to face adversity with dignity and determination. Her mother, a school teacher, had been her greatest influence, instilling in Sarah the belief that kindness was a form of strength, not weakness. Though her family's finances were limited, Sarah was determined to excel academically. She was naturally gifted, with an insatiable curiosity and a hunger for knowledge that set her apart. Her teachers quickly recognized her potential, often going out of their way to encourage her. By the time she reached high school, Sarah was at the top of her class, her passion for learning driving her to achieve more than anyone had expected. Despite her academic success, Sarah knew that pursuing her dreams would be difficult. College was expensive, and her family couldn't afford to send her without help. But Sarah wasn't the type to let obstacles deter her. She began applying for scholarships, pouring countless hours into applications, essays, and interviews. Her hard work paid off when she was awarded a full scholarship to a reputable university, an opportunity that meant the world to her and her family. At university, Sarah quickly established herself as a dedicated and ambitious student. She chose to study sociology, a field that allowed her to explore the complexities of society, culture, and identity, subjects close to her heart. Her professors noticed her intelligence and compassion, often commenting on her unique ability to understand diverse perspectives and empathize with people from all walks of life. One of her mentors was Mr. Lawson, a respected professor whose teachings went beyond textbooks. He encouraged Sarah to embrace her potential, pushing her to challenge societal norms and strive for excellence in everything she did. Under his guidance, Sarah not only excelled academically, but also grew into a confident young woman with a strong sense of purpose. Throughout her university years, Sarah continued to work at the diner, using the job to support herself and help ease her family's financial burden. Working there had taught her invaluable lessons about humility, resilience, and the importance of treating people with kindness, values that had always been central to who she was. Sarah had built strong relationships with the diner's regulars, many of whom admired her dedication and hardworking spirit. They saw her not just as a waitress, but as a young woman with dreams and ambitions, someone who was destined for great things. The community had come to respect her, and she had, in turn, become a beloved part of their lives. But her journey hadn't been easy. Sarah had often faced people like Mr. Harrison, individuals who looked down on her simply because of her background or the color of her skin. She had learned early on that prejudice could show up in subtle ways, sometimes hidden behind polite smiles, other times blatant, like Mr. Harrison's words today. Yet through each encounter, Sarah had chosen to rise above, to prove her worth through her actions rather than engaging in the negativity around her. Her achievements extended beyond the classroom and the diner. Sarah was actively involved in volunteer work, spending her weekends helping at a community center that provided support to underprivileged children. She understood what it was like to grow up facing limitations and wanted to be a source of encouragement for those who needed it most. Her efforts had earned her recognition from local organizations, and she was frequently invited to speak at events, sharing her story to inspire others. Despite all of this, Sarah remained humble, viewing her accomplishments as steps along the path she was still walking. She dreamed of one day making a meaningful impact in society, perhaps as an advocate for social justice or an educator who could inspire future generations. For Sarah, success wasn't about fame or wealth. It was about uplifting others, using her own experiences to pave the way for those who came after her. But for people like Mr. Harrison, Sarah's story was invisible. All he saw was a young woman in a waitress uniform, someone he deemed unworthy of respect simply because of her job and appearance. His assumptions were rooted in ignorance, a narrow view that had been shattered only moments ago by the revelation of her achievements. As Sarah stood behind the counter, reflecting on her journey, Mr. Lawson walked over to speak with her privately. You know, Sarah, people like him are often trapped in their own fears and insecurities, he said gently. They look down on others because they're afraid of what they don't understand. Sarah nodded, her eyes thoughtful. I suppose so, she replied. I've encountered people like him before. It's never easy, but each time I remind myself that their opinion doesn't define me. I know who I am and what I stand for. Mr. Lawson smiled warmly. And that's what makes you exceptional. You don't let the world's judgments shape you. You shape your own path. Remember that? No matter where life takes you. The words resonated deeply with Sarah. She had always believed in the importance of staying true to herself, even when the world seemed determined to push her down. Mr. Lawson's reminders strengthened her resolve, reaffirming her commitment to rise above the negativity around her. For the rest of the afternoon, Sarah continued her work with renewed determination. Every time she moved through the diner, she held her head a little higher, her spirit unbroken, her confidence unshaken. She was more than a waitress, more than someone defined by a uniform or a job title. She was a young woman with dreams, ambitions, and a heart full of compassion, a person of resilience and strength. The day's events had reminded her of the journey she had traveled, of the obstacles she had faced and conquered. And as she served each customer with a smile, she knew that no amount of prejudice or ignorance could ever take away her sense of self-worth. Sarah was proud of who she was, and she would continue to walk her path with grace, dignity, and an unwavering belief in the power of kindness and understanding. In that small diner, Sarah's story was more than just her own. It was a testament to the strength of those who rise above, who refuse to be defined by others' limitations. And she knew deep down that her story was only just beginning. As the evening rush wound down, Sarah's mind returned to the earlier confrontation with Mr. Harrison. She thought the ordeal was behind her until she saw him again, standing just outside the diner, as if he were waiting for her. His once arrogant demeanor now seemed hesitant, almost vulnerable. Sarah took a deep breath, bracing herself. Whatever he intended to say, she wanted to approach it with the same grace and dignity that had carried her through the day. She stepped outside, meeting his gaze with calm strength. Mr. Harrison shifted uncomfortably, as though struggling with words he wasn't accustomed to saying. After a long pause, he finally spoke, his voice lacking its usual sharpness. I wanted to apologize, he began, his eyes unable to meet hers directly. I may have been out of line earlier. I didn't realize who you were. I thought. He trailed off, clearly finding it difficult to finish his sentence. Sarah watched him, her expression neutral. She appreciated the apology, but she also understood the underlying implication. His regret seemed rooted in the revelation of her achievements and connections, not necessarily in any newfound respect for her as a person. Mr. Harrison, she began, choosing her words carefully, I accept your apology, but you should know that my worth, and anyone's worth for that matter, doesn't depend on titles or accomplishments. Mr. Harrison looked at her, visibly uncomfortable, as if her words were pushing him further outside his comfort zone than he had expected. I don't see things the same way, I suppose, he mumbled, an almost offensive tone creeping back into his voice. People work hard to earn respect. That's how things are. Respect isn't about accomplishments, Sarah replied gently but firmly. It's about seeing people as they are, understanding their humanity without needing them to prove themselves to you first. I may be a waitress, but that's not all I am. And even if I didn't have a degree or a professor to vouch for me, I still deserve to be treated with respect, just like anyone else. Her words seemed to hit him harder than he anticipated, and for a moment he looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. There was a flicker of realization in his eyes, an acknowledgement that perhaps he had been wrong not just about her, but about the way he viewed people in general. He hesitated, his face softening. You're right, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I've spent so long judging people by their status or background, never stopping to think about who they might actually be. He looked down, as though ashamed of the man he had been. Sarah felt a wave of compassion for him, despite everything he had said and done. She understood that changing one's perspective wasn't easy, that it required courage and humility. And in that moment, she could see that Mr. Harrison was struggling to come to terms with a new way of seeing the world. I appreciate that you're willing to see things differently, Sarah said softly. It takes strength to question our beliefs, to challenge the assumptions we've held for so long. Mr. Harrison nodded slowly, his expression a mixture of regret and gratitude. I don't expect forgiveness, he said, his voice barely audible. But thank you for giving me the chance to see things in a new light. One afternoon, as she was finishing up her shift, Sarah was surprised to see a familiar figure walk through the door. Mr. Lawson, her university professor and mentor. He had visited the diner several times since their encounter with Mr. Harrison, each time sharing a few words of encouragement or simply a warm smile that reminded her she was never alone in her journey. But today there was something different in his expression, a sense of purpose in the way he approached her. Sarah, he greeted her with a smile, his eyes warm with pride. I wanted to let you know that the university will be holding an awards ceremony next month. They're honoring students who have shown exemplary character and resilience, and I recommended you. Sarah's eyes widened in surprise, a mixture of gratitude and disbelief filling her heart. Professor, I don't know what to say. I never expected something like this. You've earned it, Sarah, Mr. Lawson said softly. The way you handled yourself in the face of adversity, the way you continue to represent yourself with grace and dignity, it's a lesson not only for students, but for everyone in our community. He continued, sharing that the ceremony would be attended by university officials, local leaders, and community members, all gathered to honor the students who had made a difference. Sarah felt a deep sense of pride and humility as she realized that her story, which had started in the small diner, had reached far beyond its walls. In the weeks leading up to the ceremony, Sarah noticed subtle changes in the way people treated her. Strangers smiled at her on the street, and regulars at the diner went out of their way to express their admiration and support. Even Mr. Harrison, who had been avoiding the diner since their confrontation, surprised her by stopping in one day. He was quiet and reserved, but there was a gentleness in his demeanor that hadn't been there before. He approached her slowly, clearing his throat as he tried to find the right words. Sarah, he began awkwardly, his gaze dropping to the floor. I heard about the ceremony, and I just wanted to say that you deserve it. You taught me a lot that day, more than I realized. Sarah looked at him, her eyes soft with understanding. Thank you, Mr. Harrison. I appreciate that. He nodded, clearly relieved, and offered her a small, sincere smile. I've been doing some thinking about the way I see people. I guess it's never too late to change. His words were simple, but to Sarah, they carried a profound significance. She had hoped that her actions might lead him to a moment of reflection, but she had never expected a full transformation. Yet here he was, a man changed not just by guilt, but by a genuine desire to become better. The night of the ceremony arrived, and Sarah, dressed in a simple but elegant dress, took her place among the other students. As the speaker introduced her, describing her journey and her resilience, Sarah felt a surge of pride and gratitude. The audience applauded, their admiration a testament to the strength of character she had displayed. When she took the stage to accept her award, she looked out into the audience and saw the faces of her family, friends, Mr. Lawson, and even Mr. Harrison. In that moment, she realized that her story had become a part of something bigger, a message of respect, empathy, and the quiet courage to stand up for oneself with grace. As she spoke, her voice steady and heartfelt, she shared the lesson that had guided her throughout her journey. We all have the power to shape how we treat others. We can choose kindness, understanding, and respect. And when we do, we not only uplift ourselves, but create a world where everyone feels valued. The audience rose to their feet in applause, the room filled with a collective appreciation for Sarah's words and actions. In that moment, she knew she had not only found her voice, but had used it to inspire a change that reached far beyond her own life. As Sarah walked off the stage, she carried with her the realization that her worth had never been defined by someone else's opinion, and her story, now shared with so many, had become a symbol of resilience and respect. a reminder to everyone of the power that lies in standing up with dignity, no matter the odds. After the ceremony, life in the town seemed brighter for Sarah. People greeted her with more warmth, and the diner, once just a place she worked to support herself, had become a space filled with familiar faces who respected her journey. Her story had touched the community, creating an unspoken bond between her and the patrons who had witnessed her strength firsthand. It was a testament to how kindness and integrity could leave a lasting mark, even in the simplest of places. Mr. Harrison, too, became a quieter presence. Though he continued to visit the diner occasionally, he was no longer the man he had once been. His words were softer, his demeanor more thoughtful, and he often exchanged friendly nods with Sarah, a small but significant shift that signaled the change he had embraced. The pride and superiority he once wore like a badge had been replaced by a humility born from self-reflection. Though he rarely spoke about the incident, it was clear he carried its lesson with him every day. Sarah herself felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey she had taken through adversity, prejudice, and eventual recognition had given her a newfound confidence. She no longer questioned her worth, no longer felt the need to prove herself to those who judged her based on superficial standards. Instead, she was deeply proud of the person she had become, understanding that every challenge she faced had helped her grow stronger. Reflecting on Mr. Lawson's words, Sarah felt a profound gratitude for the people who had supported her, both in big ways and small. The older gentleman who had stood up for her in the diner, the mother who had offered her a gentle smile, her family, her mentors, and even her regular customers had all shown her that there was kindness and understanding in the world. These small acts of solidarity had fueled her resilience, reminding her that, despite the cruelty of some, goodness remained. One quiet evening, after closing the diner, Sarah took a moment to sit alone, gazing out at the empty tables and the memories they held. This space had seen her moments of vulnerability, strength, and growth. It was here she had learned that standing up for herself was not only an act of courage, but also a gift to those around her, a reminder that self-respect was a cornerstone of dignity. Her mind drifted to the future. The award ceremony had opened doors for her, and she knew she wanted to continue on a path that would allow her to make a difference. She imagined herself finishing her studies, perhaps working as a counselor or a social advocate, helping others find their voices just as she had found hers. The possibilities felt endless, and for the first time in a long time, she looked forward to the future with a profound sense of hope. As she locked up and stepped out into the night, Sarah felt a quiet pride and gratitude in her heart. The stars above shone brightly, illuminating the path ahead, and she felt a connection to each and every one of them, as if they were guiding her forward. She knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be, that every step of her journey had led her to this moment of peace and self-assurance. Walking down the quiet streets of her small town, Sarah carried with her the strength of her story, a story that would continue to inspire those around her and remind them that respect, kindness, and resilience had the power to transform lives. She smiled, a soft and confident smile, knowing that she had found her place in the world and that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, she would meet them with the same grace and courage that had defined her journey so far. Sarah's journey in the small-town diner left an imprint not just on her, but on everyone who witnessed it. She had faced prejudice with grace, confronted adversity with dignity, and ultimately inspired others to rethink their views on respect and kindness. Her story became a quiet beacon for the town, a reminder that real strength lies in staying true to oneself, regardless of the judgments others cast. Through her actions, Sarah showed that respect isn't about status or appearances. It's about seeing the humanity in each person. Her journey reminded everyone that dignity isn't something granted by others. It comes from within. It's a choice to hold oneself to a standard of kindness, even when others fall short. Mr. Harrison, who had been so quick to judge, learned a lesson he never expected. That worth is found not in status or title, but in compassion and understanding. For him, Sarah's quiet strength revealed his own shortcomings, pushing him toward self-reflection and growth. In a world where people are often judged by their jobs, their backgrounds, or their appearances, Sarah's story is a powerful reminder that every person has value and deserves respect. Her resilience became a symbol for everyone in the town, proving that kindness can be a force for change, capable of opening hearts and transforming minds. Sarah's message is clear. Stand firm in who you are, treat others with empathy, and trust that true respect will follow. In doing so, you don't just uplift yourself. You inspire everyone around you to rise a little higher, see a little deeper, and live with a little more compassion.